Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined again today by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. How was your weekend, Josh?
Mixed, I guess. It's funny. Wait, this last weekend? It just happened?
Was that a weekend?
It was great.
Good answer.
It was great. All weekends are great.
All right. Well, over the weekend, on Saturday to be exact, the Texas Senate voted to reject all of the impeachment articles passed by the House against Ken Paxton, in case you haven't heard, reinstating him as Attorney General. This has been covered in great detail in the Texas press and the various reading sources that you probably have if you're listening to this. But there was a bit of variance on the Democratic side on a count or two. One of them in particular, I think on the open records request, didn't convince even a lot of Democrats. But for the most, and two Republicans voted in favor of most of the articles. That would be Kelly Hancock and
Senator Nichols.
And of course, Senator Robert Nichols. But the vote was largely along party lines. In essence, Republicans delivered for the Attorney General. After a summer of speculation about whether Republican senators would be willing to follow the House in holding fellow Republican accountable for these relatively serious and documented charges, and we'll get to what that means, soon enough. Paxton has been returned to office. There's been a lot of biblical allusions through this whole trial. Just before we came up for the podcast, there's a relatively new post at Texas Monthly, and forgive me, I don't remember the author. I just kind of saw it before I came up and read through it on kind of religious underpinnings and themes in Senator Paxton's postings throughout the trial. When we post we'll do a post for this podcast, and I'll try to include a link on that if we can remember to do that. Very interesting if you're interested in that kind of thing. I would say that as biblical allusions go, there was a lot of New Testament during the trial. I think we will be shifting into an Old Testament mode. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I would go with the Old Testament use. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord.
A little smitier.
I think we will be, a little smitier. I think it's very good. There will be some smiting going on, I think, in the aftermath of this by the victors. So, we'll talk a lot about the dynamics and, within the chamber, within the jury, within the legislature, the vote. But I think Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, characteristically to some degree, was able to draw a lot of attention to himself with his comments immediately after the vote. And so immediately after the votes were taken and the results registered, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, who had presided over the trial after repeatedly invoking both the importance of and providing a guarantee of impartiality in the process, weighed in after the voting was done to just excoriate the House. I think that's a fair word.
Yeah, I think so.
Saying they engaged in a flawed process and claiming that sending the charges to the Senate was fundamentally flawed and without foundation and violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Constitution. Now, those comments were couched, at least initially, in terms of getting some procedural notes on the historical record. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, and along those lines, Patrick also called for constitutional changes to the process and for an audit, and for an audit of what the impeachment investigation and the trial, the whole shebang cost. And he made that formal request to the auditor on Monday of this week, I believe.
My guess is it would have been cheaper to pay the settlement.
Well, almost certainly, I guess. And this was quite a turn. And so this was quite a turn, both
Right.
Patrick's comments and the outcome itself. Lots to unpack in terms of explaining, our understanding, which is going to be necessarily incomplete, I think, is an important thing to point out here. The why and how this happened, the weighting of different factors, and what the fallout will be. And I guess, we should probably start with a couple of conversations we've had about this.
Yeah.
One, in the search for the one thing, which I think is important to flag, because you can start digging into the multiple elements here. But like most things, and I think especially in this case, there's not one factor that's going to explain all this, I don't think.
Yeah, no, I think you and I are in an interesting position because we get asked to comment, on these, sort of current happenings sort of in real time and provide some sort of context, some sort of, I like to think of it like helpful commentary to give people a better understanding of what's going on, more so than an argument one way or the other. And in the aftermath of this, I think there's a rush one to hot takes, which is fine. I mean, whatever, that happens.
Nature of the thing.
I think it's nature of the thing. But I think in something like this, it's actually, fairly complex, and complex in a particular way. I think it leads to hot takes that in some way are actually less clarifying than they sound. I mean, I think, you get advantage in some ways by being someone who comments confidently about this sort of stuff. But if you said to me right now, hey, what one factor explains what happened? I mean, I'm going to be very resistant to tell you it was this, because really this is what we've talked about this on the podcast before. There's a lot of factors that probably were pushing in a similar direction towards this outcome. And so given that, and we'll kind of unpack some of that, I think now, to say that it was this one factor over other factors, in some ways, I think it doesn't really clarify, because what's actually going on is there's a lot of things we can't disentangle the relative impact of all of these different elements that we're going to talk about here to sort of getting to the outcome that we got to. And so what it means is that anybody who says, oh, well, it's because the House and the Senate hate each other and that's what this is. It's like, yeah, look, no doubt that contributed. Like
yes,
absolutely. So some people say, oh, well, is the national, forces going to say, yeah, I mean, sure, national forces come in and maybe activating forces that exist. We can kind of go into these, but it's not going to be one thing in such a complicated process filled with players all with their own set of, risk reward calculations for how to behave in a process that honestly was evolving as it's happening. And changing as it's happening.
And we'll circle back to some of the kind of meta implications of that and why there's such a tendency to look for the one thing. And then the other thing I kind of want to talk about, is this, the language. And I think this is both an observation. I think for both of us, it's both an observation and a caveat.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, so was Ken, and I've already sort of dipped into this in the intro.
Yeah.
Was Ken Paxton exonerated? Was he found not guilty? Was he, how do we talk about this? Was the case made or not made? And, why we're flagging this, I think will become clear as we talk more. But the language here is even very tricky to some degree in how you talk about this and the kind of impression certain kind of language leaves. And I think it's even more important because I spent some time in the last day going and, trying to track what some of the actors are saying. What kind of language is Ken Paxton going to use? I mean, sort of more to the front of my mind, what kind of language are the senators using? What kind of language is Lieutenant Governor Patrick using in describing this outcome?
Yeah, and I mean, even just to put meat on that bones, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more directly. I'll be quick, but I mean, you can imagine Paxton saying, "I was completely exonerated." You see Patrick going, and again, like a lot of the defenders of Paxton in the House, really pointing to the process and how that led them to basically have no other conclusion. But then you're also seeing senators who voted to acquit actually saying, well, the burden of proof was so very, very high.
Right.
Which is a very different message, right? And so again, for people like us trying to understand what happened, it's very easy to sort of slip into sort of your own assumptions about how convincing or unconvincing the evidence was, and then thinking about the actions in terms of your own baseline expectations. Because look, if you're a conservative, Republican primary voter who heard all the messages and completely thought that Ken Paxton was being railroaded by Democrats and rhinos or something like that, then regardless of how they got to the end point, it was the right outcome. And no other analysis that doesn't, take that into account would be right. But I think we just have to acknowledge here that people are coming at this with different sets of baseline assumptions about what exactly happened, what the process produced, and that's sort of what I think also makes
what the process should have been.
What the process should have been, and I think that makes interpretation, again, something that is very conditional on a lot of things.
Right. And the language there is
so
the language is very conditional.
And that makes, again, coming to really strong convictions, you kind of have to say, well, okay,
Well, okay, so you can, that kind of points towards, a starting point.
Let's start.
So, being trained as academics at least. And I've started with this a lot in terms of in talking about this to people that have asked about it and talking to reporters and et cetera. I think if we start with institutional factors, I mean, we talked about these a lot, particularly when the rules were written and when it began to become, I shouldn't say began to become more clear. That's not the right way to put it. We thought about this a lot when the Senate received the case and was discussing the rules and passing the rules, and we were kind of trying to read the tea leaves on what was in the rules. And, there's this very lengthy discussion that repeated itself in a lot of different ways throughout the process that looked at what was going on as this, mainly political, but also a hybrid of the legal and the political. But in the end, I think you have to say that the trial rules adopted by the Senate turned out to matter a lot.
It certainly looks like they did.
It's certainly they're mattering a lot in the post hoc explanation.
Yeah.
And I as we hear snippets about what happened during the deliberation process and the internal dynamics in the Senate as the case was unfolding, a couple of aspects of that, 2 or 3 aspects of that loom very large. I would say the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, as you kind of alluded to, as it was a good transition, turned out to be very important. And I think, we sort of recognize this, particularly as Paxton's defense sought to take explicit advantage of it during the course of the trial. This was a high bar. But it wasn't just that it was objectively a high bar in the way that we would think about it in a criminal trial.
Right.
It was a high bar in the sense of creating latitude for the senators that did not have strong dispositions going in, or for one reason or another, shall we say, were very fluid in their decision-making and how they were going to approach this. And just to put, some empirical, if Senator Drew Springer, who was somebody who was thought of as being somewhere from a swing vote to a kind of high probability yes to convict. I think inside the political community, he was not one of the Paxton Six.
Right.
In terms of the early dismissal votes, invoked this in terms of his explanation for why in the end, he voted against the impeachment articles. And he was fairly explicit in saying that, it was close, and had the threshold been lower.
Yeah, preponderance of the evidence or whatever.
Had it been a preponderance of the evidence kind of argument, and he sort of clouded this a little bit with, the difficulty in separating out what was in the public realm and what was in the evidence, et cetera. He sort of There were a lot of
a lot of hedges in there.
Yeah, there were a lot of trial balloons launched, and this is and the source on this is in one of the newspapers in Springer's district, and I don't have the link right here with me. It's been pretty commonly linked to in the last 12 hours. We'll put this on the website too, but then also it's not just the latitude that it gave those that might have been on the fence or that were sort of waiting to sort of see what developments look like. We also have heard a lot about this from those who voted in the essentially in the Attorney General's favor. You can go to the Chad Hasty show and in podcast form. Senator Paul Betancourt, one of the quote unquote Paxton Six, he had voted to dismiss in the beginning, but also invoked this in his discussion of this among a lot of other things. So functionally, this had a lot. This was a big thing. So I said a few things. There's also the denominator for determining the 2/3 threshold for conviction, including Senator Paxton, right?
Right, and 2 senators who, under any other, let me just put it this way. As the rules were adopted, right, essentially they gave the defense essentially the strongest protections as a criminal defendant would receive, as opposed to a civil trial where, again, the burden would be less, the protections would be less. Yet at the same time, included in the denominator for figuring out how many votes would be required to get to 2/3, his wife,
right,
the defense wife, someone named in one of the impeachment charges, and Senator Hughes,
right,
and someone directly involved with one of the key witnesses who didn't make it to the stand, interestingly, Paxton's alleged mistress, who worked for Senator Donna Campbell.
Right.
Now,
at some point, yes.
At some point. And
Right.
I think any person with any sort of legal knowledge would point out, in no jury trial would anyone with this kind of a connection to the case be seated as a juror. Now, look, this is not a normal jury trial. Right. But this is where...
And, look, to be fair to that decision on the Senate Rules Committee that Lieutenant Governor Patrick put together, it's a fair reading of the Constitution to say that that had to be the denominator. Nonetheless, that was a decision.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I also know that, this is sort of, it's interesting. We initially we go right into like the rules, and you say we're going to be good political scientists, but this is the thing. When you're, this is true. When you're looking at sort of outcomes in an institution in political science, especially in a legislative body, which this is, it's not a trial, the first thing you look at is the rules.
Right.
Because the rules explain a lot about this. And to your point, I agree with you. I think that probably, push came to shove. If the trial got held up because of the rules they adopted may violate the Constitution, which I think, I don't put it past them to push that. And by them, I mean the defense to push that argument. I'm not sure that they would have said, no, it's got to be all the senators, present. These are the senators have to be present.
Had they not done that, it would have been challenged in a defense motion.
At the same time, it's not a de facto truth that the Senate couldn't have adopted different rules.
Right. And then, I kind of said 3, and then, there are lots of others. But I think the third you have to say is the fact that the lieutenant governor
presided over
the trial. He was empowered to do so, but he was also empowered to step aside for somebody that was more neutral. And certainly in the aftermath of the speech he gave after the trial, there's a lot of doubt has been cast on his neutrality, and I think that is a legitimate source of doubt. I don't understand how you can hear or read that speech and not feel like, well, this certainly sounds like he had a view of the process that was in place at the outset, and he did nothing to dispel that. He was also on the Chad Hasty show yesterday, and he did nothing to dispel that. There's a certain air of, and this is a little bit glib, but I think it's not too much. There was like, well, you just got to, trust me. I kept, he sort of said, I kept my mouth shut essentially, and I presided fairly over this thing I knew was completely unfair. And I think that's, given that he had the option of stepping aside and didn't take it, I don't know how you don't factor that into the consideration of this.
Yeah, I think it's kind of impossible. And you kind of imagine, if a district court judge in Austin had, issued some consequential opinion on state government and then basically said immediately after issuing the opinion, okay, I'm not a judge anymore, but let me tell you, basically how screwed up I think the state is on this. And I've always thought this. And by the way, this actually fits into a long running battle that I have, with state agency. It's like, you'd be like, that person would probably be removed from the bench.
And then the whole factor of the money that was given him by the Texas Liberty PAC, all of the financial pieces that we talked about in
which
here,
were problematic when they happened,
that have been well aired out. All of that together, those are political factors, but I think you also have to, it's very easy to look at them through an institutional frame if you're going to assess what the institutional factors in this process were. And so it does. It raises the question of how neutral Patrick was.
You're right. And the way you said it, I think, is perfect just a minute ago, which is to say, basically you have to take all these factors that seem to point in one direction and then basically take the other side of it is, trust me.
Yeah.
I was just a judge then. It's fine. And it's sort of like, well, that's a challenge.
Yeah.
Right? It's been made a challenge. And look, I think there's an argument to be made for almost all the other things, and I think the things that are harder with evidence, like the way that he was ruling on motions throughout the trial and ruling on objections and things like that. That's a much tougher thing to kind of parse out and sort of figure out if there's a direction to that or whatever. But the fact is, I think the smoking gun, if you will, on that piece of it is the trial ends, and not the next day on the Chad Hasty show, not in a press release immediately.
Yeah, no.
This was written up and ready to go.
Part of the trial record.
Yeah, it's part of the trial record is basically what his opinion was on these charges.
Yeah.
Apparently had no influence on anything he did.
And as a footnote to that, and this bears not much on where we are, but I just can't help but mention it. I think people were sort of just disingenuous and say, initially critics of Patrick were like, oh, wow, and again, on social media, the source of all kinds of straw men for stupidity. But, it's like, oh, so I guess he just wrote that speech after the verdict. Well, of course he didn't.
Yeah.
Nobody serious really thought that. But he did say on the Chad Hasty show again that, he had 2 speeches.
I'd love to see the other one.
And so I think, the question I would raise is what is the legal status, and this is for my lawyer friends, what is the legal status of that other draft?
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, will we see that? Do we have to wait to see that in the archives? If he wants to burn it, can he burn it? I would like to see that other speech as well. So I just wanted to flag that. I didn't know if you would listen to that.
Yeah.
He did say, "Yeah, I've got another one. I've got the other one. I wrote 2. It was
well,
very
it's
interesting.
proof of his neutrality, right?
Yeah. So or
something.
Okay. So, what else? What else might we ask about this? I think we could do this in different orders. Let's start. I mean, to me, one of the things that looms very large here that I think got lost in a lot of the run-up, to my mind, and if you're somebody that included this, in one of your stories, if you're a journalist, I'm not saying nobody wrote about this. So, I mean, if you want to send me something, fine. But I think something that did get short shrift, particularly in national reporting, was the friction between the House and the Senate and between Dan Patrick and Dade Phelan. Again, not to, just be monomaniacal in our focus on Patrick's speech, but it is a rich text. It seems to have loomed large, at least in the lieutenant governor's mind.
Yeah, I mean, when this started, we recorded a podcast after the House delivered its impeachment articles. I said something at the time to you, and I know I said to other people also, which is, the analogy I used was, a flaming bag of dog poop on someone's doorstep. In this case, it was the Senate's doorstep, right? It was the end of the session. There'd been a lot of acrimony that had ratcheted up over property taxes, over school vouchers, and ultimately, has been building session after session, essentially, as the House does not meet, basically Lieutenant Governor's expectations. We'll just put it that way, right? So this is an ongoing story. And when the House essentially kicked this over to the Senate, I mean, one of the things I was thinking at the time was, if nothing else, this is just a big mess for them to deal with. And I'm not sure that wasn't, and look, again, this is going back to the whole, you can't say, oh, was that why the House did it? No, I don't think that's why the House did it. I think there's a lot of factors why the House impeached Paxton, including Paxton.
Or why the Senate voted the way they did.
Or why the Senate voted the way they did. But it doesn't mean that this wasn't, again, when the individual House members were weighing up their various considerations, including the evidence that was available to them, including whatever else they wanted to weigh, the politics of it, who knows, and in choosing to ratify, those articles of impeachment sent to the Senate, I don't think it's unlikely that for some members, part of this, what was fun was like, okay, well, now the Senate's going to have to deal with this mess. And in some ways, Patrick's speech was the bookend of that. Yeah. It was basically to say, yeah, you know what? You did put a flaming bag of turds on my front step. And you know what? I dealt with it. And now I'm going to try to throw it back, at your car or whatever, whatever the follow up is to that,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think
a lot of feces thrown
around. The thought experiment that I sort of engaged in at one point was, if you were somebody that watched the process and, you watched the House deliver the impeachment to the Senate, and then the following week or so, you watched the House come back in the special session.
You went to a coma or something.
Side with the governor and then adjourn. So 2, is basically another bag. Oh, by the way, here, have another.
Yeah.
And then you left Austin because the weather was too bad, and you went someplace where you had no media access or you couldn't follow the process. And then you dropped back into town about the time that Patrick was giving this speech. Yeah. You'd kind of go, well, it seems like I didn't miss much.
Yeah, nothing happened. It's
still going and just getting worse.
Right.
And so, I mean, I think that, that gets missed, I think, in a lot of, again, from a national perspective on this, and you really can't, I think any explanation that looks at this dynamic, and it, of course, leads you to other ways, which, will lead us to the next factor, another factor. Right. It overlaps with other things, but there is something right there that again is right at the it's like the intersection of 2 major thoroughfares of politics and institutional factors, right?
Yeah.
Where they're over, it's ideology and institutions, right? I mean, there's and they're really fueling a lot of conflict that clearly is at play and is continuing, and is only going to get worse.
Well, what the thing is, and I mean, I'd said this before, and I think this is true. Patrick woke up that day and chose violence. As I said, I mean, because look, I think, I'd said all along, my expectation was that they were going to acquit him, and what they were going to say was, and even the Republicans who didn't vote to dismiss the charge early on, it would have been easy enough to say, these are serious charges, we're going to listen to the evidence, but you know what, we listen to the evidence. In some cases, what they already says, I thought they'd say, and it wasn't enough to remove someone from office. We respect this process too much. Now, they found another way, which is to say, at least again, among the sort of a lot of the senators who seem to have some misgivings about their vote or feel like they need to explain it, they pointed to the high burden of proof as sort of an out for them, because that allows them to say, they're not really saying what they thought either way. They're saying, well, the burden of proof was so high.
Yeah.
Right. And that kind of gets them out of it. Patrick could have said something similar. It's like, we agreed that this was the burden. It was a high burden. He could say, hey, look, this wasn't enough. But instead he said, this is the House's fault.
Yeah.
And so he threw more gas on the fire when it wasn't entirely necessary, but that's a choice that's been made now. So it really is an escalation.
One of the things that I think we've talked about in here and certainly, has been discussed is that, and is reflected in the point you're making, is that if you assume that, look, one of the biggest questions all along was where's the lieutenant governor in all of this? What are his priorities given his obvious control and influence over the Senate and his large role in the political system writ large?
Right.
And if you were to say, what are, Dan Patrick's top 5 priorities here? I don't think looking out for Ken Paxton was in the top 5.
No.
Maybe, certainly one in the top 3. And I think the way that you put that, was interesting is Lieutenant Governor Patrick did not spend any time in that speech saying, and by the way, this really shows you that Ken Paxton did not deserve any of this and is a great guy. It was just, thumping on the House and to move on to a kind of another factor here, and invoking and re-inflaming the factional politics in the Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but point this out. It doesn't matter. I just have to say it. But I mean, the idea that he's excoriating the House for basically their rushed process while lauding the Senate for basically limiting the amount of time that they could devote to this incredibly important task was like, again, you can't follow politics closely if you get too upset or worked up about.
Obsessed with consistency?
Yeah, but I mean, that moment in and of itself to me was just amazing, just for what it was. But it also shows that, maybe it wasn't really about the process.
Yeah. And so, I think, let's talk about the
factional
that.
politics here.
The House-Senate conflict obviously overlaps in complex ways. And it's tricky to sort this out, and we'll try to do this in a reasonable way, with the factional politics in the Republican Party. And it's tricky because, as we've said in here, but just to sort of hit the point again, I think, for immediate use, it's oversimplifying to say that, as some people will try to say, and I think it sort of favors one side over the other, to say that the Senate is the conservative chamber and the House is the moderate chamber or the less conservative chamber, because I think there's a lot of evidence that you can look at, output, vote analyses, a lot of different things that say that, we're talking about a pretty narrow ideological spectrum here. You have to parse this very carefully. That's not to say that the quote-unquote movement/dissident conservatives don't have more sway in the Senate than they do in the House, because I think they do.
Yeah.
But it is to say that you can't just sort of get an ideological space and say, Senate's here, House is here, and the Senate is just the more conservative body.
Yeah, and just, just for the sake of it, it's interesting the way you put that, because it is sort of, you're actually talking about two different things. In some ways, I think you actually see I should say this. This is true across both chambers. On the votes that that get taken.
Right.
I think you can see more of the ideological spread and the division that exists in the House because, one, there are more members, there are more numbers, but two, there's no Patrick who is standing over it, who is going to say, if you don't vote this way, this is what's going to happen.
And the House process is very different than the Senate process.
The House process is very different. And it's not even the case that Patrick even needs to say to a senator who wants to vote against a conservative priority of his, you don't vote against that. That senator knows that he or she cannot vote against that without the possibility of engendering some kind of retaliation. And I think even on this trial, there's been a lot of accounts kind of floating around out there that, there were probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 19 to 20 votes overall that would have gone for a conviction. But once those Republicans learned that they weren't going to get to 21, against where the numbers come in, again, it's kind of important, that basically there was no benefit to them to actually, take a principled stand on the evidence, because ultimately they were just going to get punished both by Patrick directly. He doesn't need to say that. But also by outside groups, potentially by voters. By
now,
who
to be
knows.
fair to Patrick, he has plausible deniability on that. I mean, this is an interpretation on our part.
No, it's absolutely. But I'm talking about. But what I'm saying is, I'm applying what is, I think, a pretty well known and standard mode of operation when we talk about most legislative affairs, votes, bills, things like that. Does it apply to this process? Well, I'd like to say no, but again, looking at what we've seen, it's kind of hard to think that this is totally different.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be naive to think that just because this is institutionally a different process and nominally a different process, that it's not taking place in the context of the Texas Senate as run by Dan Patrick.
Yeah, I think it's just easy. It's very easy to sort of maximize the distance between the two chambers, when in reality, if you were to just, look at the preferences of the individual members in each chamber, they'd probably be closer looking than I think some of the conflict suggests on some of these big issues. Because really you're talking about Patrick, who is very conservative and has very conservative policy priorities, and a House that has a little bit more ideological heterogeneity on this stuff.
Right.
Okay.
So, yeah, I agree with that. So, So one aspect of this has been then, in terms of like the assessing where factional politics played into this, the drumbeat from the very beginning of this process back in the spring from, again, language. What are we going to call them? The dissident right groups.
I like the dissident right. I think, and I like, you use it a while ago. The reason I like it, and I just want to say, is the way that I think about it is that we know that there are individuals on the far right of the party, especially in the House, who have been to some degree outside of the levers of power. They've been incorporated in by leadership sort of session over session, really going back to beginning in the Tea Party wave and then kind of going to now. But I mean, when we talk about what is ultimately underlying, a lot of this sort of angst and stuff, it's agenda control and it's about power, right?
Yeah. And
they don't drive the agenda to the extent that they'd like to or feel that they should.
And I like the term dissident to as a shorthand for that. And also, it's also, it's a little bit of it's a slightly more both flexible, but also maybe a little bit more precise than just saying ins versus outs. Although there's an aspect of that.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it's not.
I like this, because it shows a range, because sometimes they're in, sometimes they're out.
Right, and two of the loudest pro Paxton voices, are former House members who's made a judgment at some point that they were no longer viable in the House. Now, there's all kinds of other rationales for deciding to leave the House, and situations, and so all of that kind of leads to an interesting sidelight here that I think both of us want to talk about, and that is, there was an interesting Axios story that it was credited to Mike Allen, the head of Axios, and came from Politico, really a DC guy. Axios being primarily an email outlet, it seems to me. The subject line and headline as a scoop in all capitals that, based on his sourcing, it was supposed to be a sort of a big part of the explanation here, or the explanation that sort of national right-wing forces had worked through these dissident forces, elements in the state to pressure potential anti-Paxton senators or anti-Paxton votes in the Senate through, email campaigns and phone calls and social media appearances. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the whole, there's two key things I want to focus on. There's a lot that we could focus on. One is there's a lot of pushback from Texas, not a lot, but there was some public and some other behind-the-scenes pointed pushback from Texas-based journalists about the fact that this was some kind of scoop, because, in fact, it was pretty common knowledge. I mean, look, that was part of the strategy. Yeah. Steve Bannon and Donald Trump both nationally declared their allegiances to Paxton and, criticized the House and, echoed and amplified the lines that had been coming from inside the state for quite a long time. Now, there were a few new dots to connect that I think were in the Mike Allen story. But I think that it really underlines, this is kind of one of our Exhibit A, I think, on this, where we started in terms of not thinking about this as liable to a monocausal explanation, not to be too wonky about it. But I mean, to read that angle on the story, I think, was to walk away with the impression, among other things, that what really carried the day here was a coordinated effort by national right-wing forces
out of state,
from outside the state, to kind of come in and Bigfoot this and provide the decisive push in Paxton's defense.
Yeah, I think this is a great example of this sort of overdetermination thing. And what I mean here in some ways is, it's easy to look at the outcome here and say, well, this was politics as usual. And I think a really simple example of like a read of politics as usual would be, well, yeah, the Republicans voted against the Democrats and he got out. It's like, that's not what we mean when we say politics as usual.
Right.
When we're talking about politics as usual in the state of Texas, we're talking about the oversized influence of the activated, engaged segments of the Republican primary electorate, who's a very small share of the Texas population overall, but generally tend to have an outsized influence on most political outcomes, on setting the agenda, and on things like this. Now, look.
And on the other hand, and joined to that, the risk and work sensitivity of incumbent Republicans in the state.
Right. And again, we talked about it here too, especially Senate incumbents who have to face a very large district in which, if you can mobilize a significant share of this very small share of the district against you, and you have a reason.
In low turnout Republican primary elections.
There is always a candidate, but also because of this factional politics we're talking about, there's always funding. And there's funding within the state that has nothing to do with national groups, has nothing to do with, Texas is not receiving a bunch of money from out of state to run Republicans in GOP primaries. Full stop. That is not happening.
There's no evidence of that.
Well, not there's no evidence, but just take a step back and think logically. Does anyone out there really think that going into the next election cycle, the priority of national Republican groups is going to be to spend money in Texas on statewide races to move Republicans out of office to replace them with candidates who might have a lower electoral probability?
Right.
As opposed to maybe, I don't know, spending money in competitive states on the presidential election. I mean, it's kind of insane. But the other piece of this, the overdetermination, is like, if this is politics as usual, this the powers, what it means is like these are also
politics as usual as we see it, or as they see it.
Politics as usual as we see it.
Okay.
So if this is politics as usual as we see it, then what are the other features of that? Well, the other feature that we talk about all along is that Paxton's biggest strength is with the engaged Republican primary voters. He has cultivated that constituency consistently. Activating that constituency to about an alleged cabal between Democrats and rhinos is something that in-state forces do on a regular basis. So look, does this mean that the national money that came in and amplified that message or echoed it or reverberated did not have an impact? Sure. I'm sure it did have some kind of an impact, but it's a marginal impact over what is already kind of baseline politics in the state and what was already going on really from the moment the impeachment charges were sent to the Senate.
Right. And we've been, this is in no way meant to imply, look, we told you, because I certainly didn't. But that was really apparent in some of the numbers that we published, right? I mean, I think maybe the second post after we released the post, after we released the latest poll results in August, from the August poll, I think there was a point in that post that was, this is where Paxton's support is strongest, allowing for the fact that there were, particularly compared to Trump, a lot of people that were reserving judgment in those groups too.
Right.
But nonetheless, if you just looked at the people that weren't reserving judgment, that were expressing a view, Paxton's support, no matter what dimension you looked at, whether your view of whether this was mostly politics or based on the facts, your view of, your job approval of Paxton, your view of whether the impeachment was justified, your view of whether he should be removed, his support was strongest against those who identified as strong Republicans and especially those who identified as extremely conservative.
Right.
And so, all of that, if you step back, I think underlines, this kind of how the politics of the House-Senate conflict and the ideological factional politics, there's a Venn diagram there.
Yeah.
That, was, I think not super clearly determined going into this, but, there were some leading indicators that if you were an entrepreneurial, opportunistic, national political figure like a Steve Bannon or these other folks that Mike Allen, I think, is talking to or watching.
Yeah.
That there was, an obvious target for your efforts.
Right.
Everybody also has an incentive now after the fact to call up reporters and say, hey, you know what, we did this.
I love this.
I think that's got to be kept in mind here.
Yeah, there's an observation always that, the winners the winners always stick around and claim credit and the losers kind of walk off.
Yeah. What's the old cliche? I'm sort of proud that I probably can't get this right, that,
there's no coincidence.
Failure has 1,000 success has 1,000 fathers and failure none.
Right.
Yeah. Something like along those lines. All right. So we're going to, we've been going for a while, but let's hit a couple more things and we'll come back and start talking about the future, maybe, next week or the week after, but hopefully begin to move to some other things. I will admit to our listeners, I think you're probably interested. I think we've been following the market, but I was looking at the podcast. We're fully aware that probably 4 of the last 6 podcasts have been largely Paxton focused. But
remember, we could have done it every day.
Yeah,
we could have done. We could have done a Ted Cruz style verdict.
You did float it so are we just going to do a podcast every day after
Ted Cruz style the verdict?
Right, and this gave me stomach and headaches enough as it was. How does this impact Dade Phelan's standing in the House?
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? I think, the question, I think the basic first question I ask is, does this embolden, again, these sort of dissident, forces that exist in the House? Ultimately, it's tough to say. I think that there's a way to think that he looks weakened because, if just based on the most basic thing that we talk about a lot in here, which is, the speaker usually likes to not be known.
Right. And in that case, this is not helpful.
Dade Phelan's name has been basically taken right through the mud multiple times in the last few weeks, very directly. And, to the extent that blame is being laid, at his feet among conservative Republicans, especially, we'll see what happens. I think what's interesting, again, to the institutional piece of this, we're still not in a session right now. We're not even in a special session yet. So the legislature is going to go away for a little bit. But, if the trial ended with Patrick being Patrick, which is kind of normal in some ways, and the way that he sort of reinforced this House-Senate argument, the question becomes: do the forces that are aligned against Phelan, and again, a majority of House Republicans who put him in that position, do they feel emboldened by this, and what do they do with it?
And to be fair, and not to echo the criticism of him, but it would be unfair to not mention this, that put him in this position with the cooperation of a critical mass of Democrats.
For sure.
Right. Yeah. Look. I think in some ways you can oversimplify this, but I think as a starting point, it's not. Is this going to solidify Phelan's support in the face of Patrick's posing of this as, so directly the Senate had to come in and correct all this crap that the House did? Or how much is it going to activate, in some ways, the House being the House, that even if you're the most successful speaker, there are always a lot of people in the chamber that think, I could do a better job of this. And so, how is, the oppositional, again, a different version of it, the in-group, out-group tension between the Senate and the House that Patrick is clearly stoking, as are some of his allies.
Yeah.
And, look, if you start looking and reading between the lines of some of the responses of the senators who voted with Paxton, and even some who didn't, there's a lot of very complex signaling going on here. Some subtle things going, look, I was in the House. It was cool. I've also been in the Senate now. There's a certain amount of, hey, I don't want to get involved in this, but, maybe mistakes were made. I don't know.
I always think that if you're a member in one of these bodies and someone can take the arrows for you, you're pretty happy for them to do it till they're dead.
Yes.
And Phelan is going to be that guy.
Right.
The flip side is, I think, the House has shown itself pretty explicitly that one of the dimensions that they have considered in putting a speaker forward the last few sessions has been someone who is going to stand up to Patrick. And really, the question becomes, after all of this, does this fundamentally change us in a way that the House is, and again, the majority of House Republicans are more inclined to put someone in charge who is more sympathetic to Patrick than someone they put in recently. And that seems a little hard for me to imagine at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But I think the other scenario is, and I'm choosing my words carefully here. You don't want to underestimate the opportunism that is always at work. These are, look, politics is always in part. I mean, there's no other area, I think, of life in which, maybe business, in which opportunism can be coded in a positive way as an attribute.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So, to the extent, to go back to your metaphor, I mean, yep, it's great to have somebody that you can use to absorb
human
arrows
shield, yeah.
until there's no more room to absorb any more arrows. And then what do? You toss them aside and think about
what's next.
Yeah. And so I just don't,
again, I agree with that.
I don't know what look, my gut feeling is that for the most part, people are going to rally around Phelan, or at least a sufficiently critical mass
right.
will continue to back him. And I think that's probably the safest bet.
Yeah.
But we're also going to have to see what the politics of the next special session look like. I think it's going to be very critical.
Yeah, and I'll say this.
In terms of, giving us more data about and shifting the ground a little bit in terms of, how strong Phelan's support is and if people stick with him or not.
I think that the one thing I think you can say is, does this significantly increase the probability that Phelan sees a challenge for Speaker next time around? Yeah, I think it does. I mean, just as I think.
Sure.
That's something we can say right now. So what else? You want to do a couple more of these?
A stronger challenge than he had last time.
Yeah,
let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the last thing we can't. I think we should get out of here soon. But I think we can't do this without also ending with how does this, the interesting question of how this impacts Ken Paxton's standing.
Yeah, let's do that.
To go back, this is in some ways maybe a slightly backhanded plug for Axios. Axios led in their Texas.
Yeah, it's on the Dallas one. I think.
But I think it appeared in at least one of the. But I think it was also in the AM briefing. Okay. Although it didn't lead. Axios is also leading today with the contention that the trial has raised Paxton's profile by connecting him with a national audience of conservative voters, and that, in the end, this has been, a boosting effort for Paxton. I think you're a little more skeptical of this than I am, but I'm not sure in terms of our early conversations. I might be misreading that wrong. Or I may have just not expressed myself.
No, I mean, I am. I think it's. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong on its face. I just think it's too simple. I mean, the idea, it's one of those all publicity is good publicity kind of maxims, which isn't true. I
think that would have been more applicable if he had been convicted, but.
Well, I mean, but even so, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, I think to the point where we started on this is actually nice wrapping it up is, what's the takeaway from this? Is the takeaway that Ken Paxton was exonerated, that he was found to have done nothing wrong? I mean, ultimately, we've had 2 weeks where a lot of evidence was presented that was clearly very troubling, even to many of the senators who voted to acquit him. So, right. I mean, I don't necessarily, and I look.
Hence the talk about the threshold being very high.
Yeah, and the other piece, I just don't think that being impeached by a Republican majority legislature in a state that I think people outside the state think of as being dominated by Republicans is so easily rationalized in the way that it's been tried to be rationalized, which is, this is really like rhinos and Democrats. And, I think if you're a Republican from New Jersey, you're saying, what? Are you kidding me? And I think, that's actually not an unreasonable reaction. So I think there's that piece. The other thing is, I think there's something that, we wrote about this just before, I think the weekend, about how, the ways in which Ken Paxton's attitudes in Texas, at least towards Ken Paxton, are not synonymous with sort of attitudes towards Donald Trump along these dimensions. We found a lot more benefit of the doubt for Donald Trump. We found over time that generally, regardless of sort of his legal problems, if anything, it solidified the Republicans mostly with him for the most part. We didn't really see that with Paxton. We saw the opposite. We saw that as Republicans learned more about this, they were more likely to be skeptical. They were more likely to say the House was justified. They were more likely to think he might, be removed from, maybe should be removed from office. They were more likely to think that the charges were fact-based. And so, to me, part of it is since everyone's sort of focused on the process and the site, and I think for Paxton, you come out and you say, hey, I was persecuted and exonerated, and and I'm just, someone who's generally a little bit reticent. I'm reticent about Donald Trump's national standing because of the fact that the trials, I don't think that they necessarily, or all the indictments, I don't think that the actual content of them necessarily matters. I think it's going to affect his campaign. And I think one of the challenges Donald Trump has is in mobilizing people to basically take his grievances as their grievances, which I think, when you're talking about I
think it's harder to do as the grievances get more rarefied.
Right. Exactly. So that's a good way to say that. And I think, but yet Donald Trump has been able to do that. But Donald Trump has also demonstrated himself as an incredibly unique political entity. People talk about how he, basically talk about how, Teflon Don and all this stuff and how these things seem to make him stronger and how unique that is. And they seem to be applying that same framing to Paxton. Yet none of the data or evidence indicates that, his level of support among Republicans or the trend in it at all looks anything like Donald Trump over that period of time, in the sense that Donald Trump seems to have gotten stronger despite these things. Ken Paxton has definitely gotten weaker in the polling data. And the fact that he was, whatever you want to say the Senate did, let him off, whatever. On its face, that to me doesn't read, okay, now this guy is going to go out there and basically use his grievances and say, oh, you might get impeached too.
Right, let me buttress your argument slightly and then dissent slightly. So by buttress, I mean, part of the problem with it is also that Donald Trump has only gotten stronger to the extent that as the presidential nomination campaign has started, he has demonstrated consistent strength versus the rest of the field.
Right.
His overall numbers are actually a little bit down.
Yeah.
And as we've said in here and as we put in the piece, whether that maintains or not as we get into a more,
real phase.
If he's the nominee and as we get into a more polarized general election, whether those numbers change again or not, open question. But for now, they are down. They're not down a lot.
Yeah.
They're down, depending on the polling, depending on, whether we're looking at Texas or we're looking at national aggregate polling, down like 5 to 8 points, maybe in some places more like 3 to 7.
Yeah.
Now, closely divided national electorate, mobilization election, numbers have fallen among independents. He's actually not stronger.
Right.
And so I think Donald Trump is like the Hulk.
Yeah.
The angrier he gets, the stronger he is kind of bullshit.
Right.
Right. And I think we need to be clear about calling bullshit on that. And so there's that. Now, in terms of, I think, the Paxton thing, I mean, I think it's more interesting. And I think, this is like stating the obvious in some ways. It's obviously like more helpful to him to have not been convicted than to have been convicted.
Sure.
Right. But I do think that, one of the interesting things about our polling numbers this far and the kind of thing we've been, the drum we've been beating kind of all summer and certainly since we got the August numbers is that people were not paying attention.
Yeah.
And that they were not, and in something that was not a top tier interest of them, as our numbers shown in August compared to other big political issues in the news, something that they were not receiving clear, unambiguous, elite partisan signaling on, because in part the gag order and in part because there were a lot of Republicans that were reticent.
Yeah.
We don't really have a good sense of what people are going to think. I mean, I would argue that, and we'll see, the empirical question, hopefully we'll have an answer to after our next poll, are people going to report having heard more about this in our next poll?
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of think so. And I think we're also going to see we're now going to see relatively more unified Republican signaling on this that is going to break in Paxton's way.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say it's a net gain for him, but I also think that, to go back to, the Axios Q, I wouldn't want to go too far with this.
Yeah, well, look, I think here's the key point, right? I think I want to use our data for 1 second, and I think this is the key point here. We don't know yet how this has affected him, which is fine. Here's the reason I'm reluctant to say that this is some sort of net win for him. So in our last poll, right, and here we're just talking about, in August of this year, right before the trial, right, 23% of Republicans disapproved of the job Paxton was doing, and approval was 46%. That was the lowest approval he's had and the highest disapproval he's had among Republicans. At the beginning of this trial, 24% of Republicans, so a quarter, 1 in 4, said that, basically he took actions that justify removing him from office. 1 in 4 Republicans. That is a lot.
Yeah.
Right? 28% said the Texas House was justified in impeaching him, and 23% said it was mostly based on facts. So you have about a quarter of the Republican electorate who heard about this and basically, pretty much consistently said, this is a serious problem. Now, look, maybe with the verdict, they say, oh, my bad. I guess he was exonerated. Everything's fine. And maybe these numbers bounce back. But having something happen that basically has a quarter of your electorate essentially turn on you, I don't see how you can interpret that in the short, medium, long term as good. I don't know how he could have that happen here, and the idea that somehow a completely different sort of nationalized version of this is filtered out in such a way, again, to a smaller share of the national audience.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you were to say right now, is Paxton strengthened or weakened by this? Based on what we know at the moment, this was not good for him. I mean, because again, to your point, it's like, yes, he was exonerated. Another way to put it is the impeached attorney general, the impeached by a Republican House in Texas attorney general. I mean, there's a lot of baggage to this that I think we're gonna have to wait and sort of withhold judgment on with the polling data. But again, to sort of kind of come out of this and sort of say with such confidence, like, well, this really strengthens Paxton, and it's like, I want to just let's hold off on that. And
so you're saying it's another instance in the podcast. Well, this was before we came on, in which Nietzsche was wrong.
Oh, and with that, Nietzsche.
I think we'll see. There's a lot to unpack there, I think, in terms of how this institutional, again, what the signaling is going to be like as more Republicans in particular pay attention to what they're hearing about this. I think we're going to see something sort of in the middle, which is I don't know, but I kind of suspect his numbers are going to improve.
Yeah, I think they'll improve.
But will they improve dramatically? I doubt it. But among whom is also
well, the question I think that we're going to look at, just to pull the curtain back, is does his floor and ceiling change from this? I mean, presumably a lot of people got introduced to Ken Paxton through this process who weren't paying a lot of attention to him. It's a little bit down ballot relative to the governor, the lieutenant governor, senators, things like that. Now that this is all kind of wrapped up and we go into the field again at some point in the not too distant future, let's see what the trend lines look like.
Yeah, and whether it's a shift in direction. I mean, in a more technical sense, that's kind of what we're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. The decline you were talking about was really pretty kind of steep.
Yeah, it's been ongoing and steep.
Right, and ongoing. I expect it to reverse. Will it? What is that reversal going to look like? Yeah. And so that means it won't just be the next poll.
Yeah.
And it'll be like, what are we going to see in the next 3 or 4?
Exactly.
I think. So on that, Josh, thanks for a very stimulating discussion.
Thanks.
Thanks to all of you for listening. As always, thanks very much to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. We have talked about some data today, and as I said, we'll put a post together if you're listening to this on a podcast platform that will appear at our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. As soon as we wrap up here, I'll make a list of all the things I've promised and try to deliver. So thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.